That's why we need to encourage businesses to invest in capital so that we're more automated. That's why in the budget we introduced full expensing, which makes it very competitive to invest in capital in the UK.
It tells you that the 2030 phase-out date saves billions of pounds across our economy. Today's measure isn't cost-reducing, it is cost-raising.
What is your response to that? That yes, we want to keep people safe, but we also need to protect people's privacy online.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and particularly on a day where the climate seems to be underlining its importance and making us all very keenly aware of the weather. My name is Kate Day. I am Politico Europe's Deputy Editor-in-Chief. I founded Politico here in the UK back in 2017, and we've been quietly but steadily building ever since then, I would say. I'm sure it won't be news to most of you in the room, or I hope it won't be news to most of you in the room, that we now cover energy and climate in quite some detail. You may not know the history, but Politico was founded in Washington in 2007, and we've developed this model of covering politics and policy in a distinctive, non-partisan, slightly different way, we like to think. We've taken that recipe from Washington to Brussels and now to London, Paris, Berlin, California. We're gradually expanding out. We aim to be in every democratic country. We're not sure it works beyond democracies, so we're pretty committed to being in democracies, but our aim is to be the best for politics and policy everywhere in the democratic world. And one of the secrets of our success, and one of the places we've expanded, particularly in the UK in the last year, is Politico Pro. That's our intelligence service, the backbone of which is this distinctive, detailed policy coverage. We are geeks, we love the detail, we want to hear from everybody on all sides of the debate and really get beneath the politics into the substance of what political decisions mean for all of our lives, for the economy, for Britain's place in the world. And I'm delighted to have such a fantastic team here with me who you will hear from in a minute. But first I wanted to just thank our sponsors, thank all of you for being in the room, and thank our guests who are joining us on stage. We are delighted to hear from you all. As I said, hearing from every side of the argument is a big part of what we do at Politico. The Secretary of State actually asked if, instead of being interviewed by me, she could provide a little video for you all, and we said, no, thank you very much. We do journalism. We want to hear really what you think, and we want to be able to scrutinize that. So that's us, that's what we're about. I'm going to hand over to Russ, our UK energy editor, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, and he's going to have a conversation with our new energy team. So Russ and team, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, ever so much. Kate said two things which I think are very true there. One is that we are journalists. That's definitely true. And the other that we're geeks, which I think, I don't want to put these three guys in that category, but you can all make your own minds up over the next couple of hours as to how this all unfolds. I'm Russell Hargrave. I'm the editor of the UK Climate and Energy Reporting Team for Politico. As Kate said, about 1 year old. We look back a year and we think, well, Grant Shapps was the shiny-faced new Secretary of State, just getting his feet under the table. We didn't know whether or not there'd be licensing permission for Rosebank. There were so many questions we didn't know. And now we've moved forward a year very, very quickly, a lot of policy developments in very little time. To introduce the people who have actually been doing all the hard work, editors really, all you do is move words around and put some inverted commas in. The guys who are really working on this, to introduce the team, left to further left, Abby Wallace, Charlie Cooper, and Nick Earle. And these guys will get a chance to talk a little bit more shortly. But just to give an overview, since the moment we started this product in last June, net zero by 2050. That's been the great lodestar, if you like, the thing that we have focused on as reporters pretty much continuously. Who are the characters who are going to get us there as a country or not? The politicians, the officials, the industry leaders, the skeptics and the zealots across the board, as Kate says, talking to everybody, frankly, who's got an interesting opinion and might be newsworthy. We've wanted to make sure that we can serve people who are getting that morning newsletter, reading our news, our breaking stories, to tell you all about it. And if you did know that the Chancellor had oil and gas executives into number 11 yesterday to try and cheer them up because they're worried about tax rises, you knew it because Nick reported it. And it was him who covered that before anybody else. If you know, for example, that the Energy Charter Treaty that the UK has been so unhappy about for so long, finally that kind of split is happening, we know it because Charlie broke that story. And if we know that Kemi Badenoch and Claire Coutinho don't really see eye to eye on all sorts of issues about the UK economy, including green subsidies, that's because Abby was the person who brought that story to you before anybody else. So obviously I'm biased. I think everything we do is pretty much terrific, and I hope we're going to have a chance to kind of show a bit more of that and learn so much more in the next sessions. So on which topic? Charlie, you'll be talking about rewiring the country for as long as I've known you for the last year. You've always been keen to talk about pylons and grid reform. Why is this such a big issue? What are you going to touch on?
Well, you talked about geeks, and I feel I have become a bit of a pylon geek. There is a, you might be familiar with the Twitter account, Pylon of the Week, I think it is.
Who isn't familiar with that?
I mean, I follow it. I think we all should. No, the first panel is called Rewiring the Country, so we're talking new renewables to get to those totemic clean power targets 2035 if you're the government, 2030 if you're Labour. And when we talked about when we first launched and how things have changed since then, one thing I guess has not changed is that when we were setting out, everyone I spoke to said that grid is kind of the education of this sector. And we've seen a lot of developments in the past year on that front, but I don't think it's going to stop being an absolutely critical issue. Just today, you've got Labour with their first steps, their kind of pledge card for the election. One of them is GB Energy, and that segues into their Clean Power 2030 target, something they're putting pretty close to the centre of their political offer for voters. And I think that means if we do have a Labour government, it's only going to grow in political salience, the ability or inability to meet that quite stretching target. So we'll be talking about all of that, including maybe a bit about Mallard Pass Solar Farm, which just today has had a decision delayed on its consent. So something to talk about there as well.
And just very quickly, the role of sort of people who don't want pylons in their back gardens is a big part of this as well.
How could I launch into this without mentioning the NIMBYs? Yes, you're quite right. No, that perhaps is where the political salience will bite. And we covered some research actually by Public First, which interestingly found that a Labour government would be in a position to maybe implement a lot of these changes, put up all those pylons in constituencies, which actually belong to Conservative MPs. So, but will a Conservative Party in opposition take that lying down? Will newspapers take that lying down? It could be an interesting 5 years if Labour do get into power and do try and achieve that 2030 target.
Cracking stuff, thank you. Abby, you're going to be talking about Contracts for Difference, the great renewables subsidy programme, which has been a real success story, I think, in policymaking. And then last year, fell off a bit of a cliff and wasn't much of a success story. What's the role, do you think, for Contracts for Difference going forward?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Contracts for Difference scheme has been a UK success story. It's been at the forefront of the government's energy strategy up to this point in terms of bringing more renewables online, decarbonising the power sector, providing that sense of real price certainty for investors. A significant chunk, I think it's maybe around more than half, of the UK's offshore wind capacity has been secured through CFD auctions. Maybe our panellists might want to correct that later, but I think it's in and around that ballpark. But crucially, the scheme has not delivered the capacity in recent auction rounds to hit decarbonisation targets. That's especially true for offshore wind. Auction round 5, as I'm sure many people in this room will know, did not receive any bids for offshore wind. And industry had warned for some time that the price parameters were not set accordingly to account for inflationary pressure and that the strike price was just far too low. And I think that was a real setback for the sector and for the government's energy strategy as a whole. And it means there's a lot of pressure on the next round, AR6, which is just open to deliver and to make up for that lost capacity. The reason the government really needs to deliver in the next round is the scheme is also operating in a very different climate to the one in which it was first introduced. The cost of delivering these projects is increasing. There are big global pressures. The UK is not the only country or the only place competing for this investment. And also there are targets to hit 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Ministers have adjusted the parameters for the next auction round, but the window that the government has to deliver on those targets is only getting narrower. So I'm sure our panellists will have more to say on that later.
I'm sure, and find out how optimistic or not industry and politicians are about working together on it. And Nick, finally, you'll be talking later on about carbon capture, this sort of always promised, sometimes ready technology that a lot of people are relying on very strongly, I think, to kind of help steer us towards net zero. How do you see it? Is carbon capture the kind of future of getting us green, or is it a bit of a delight for anyone who's polluting and can carry on polluting?
Yeah, that's right. So for any of the energy nerds, the vanguards will be here for all 3 sessions. You'll see the CCS discussion later today. The way I'd put it really is that the question really is about, does the government have any other choice? And that's really sort of the key argument you're kind of hearing from people within the industry, almost in a way similar to the controversy around biomass, which is, it probably isn't ideal to be burying emissions underneath the seabed and continuing oil and gas production, but do we actually have any other credible means to reach net zero while not shivering in our cold, dark homes? And I guess when it comes to this, I'll be happy to grill Equinor, one of our benevolent sponsors, about the £20 billion government pledge there's been towards carbon capture. For context, about half of Hinkley Point C we're talking about here, so quite a hefty outlay. And the fact there's not been that much in terms of development since September, really, when Track 1 and Track 2 kind of got unveiled. So hopefully we'll be hearing Equinor's case for their projects. We're hearing also from the very learned Green Alliance, who will offer a robust differing of opinion, and also seeing what other alternatives there could be. So I think it should be a lively pre-happy hour session.
And that, you mentioned the 20 billion in government investment, which is spread over quite a long period. What's your sense of whether or not that sort of sum of money is going to make a difference? Is that going to kind of attract the sort of extra investment that's needed, do you think?
I mean, without trying to sound a little bit cheeky, it really should. It's a vast sum of money, and we're talking about companies that have themselves very significant cash flows that are making a case that are going to transition towards net zero. Now, this is probably the least painful operation of doing that compared to commitments to offshore wind and commitments to green hydrogen storage, for example. So you would think this would be an area where they could really offer their expertise, their insight, their approach, and we can actually really see some quite material commitments with the funds that have been offered.
Okay.
It's also, it's related to my panel and the 2030, 2035 targets as well, isn't it? Because as far as I understand it, both of those depend on a bit of carbon capture. There's an understanding that there's a degree of unabated gas for flexibility in the system, but a significant amount of gas still in the system needs to have carbon capture attached to it, and biomass as well, for those to be achievable. And I just, until we see sort of concrete action, literally concrete action, spades going into the ground, maybe end of this year, is that really feasible by 2030? Well, maybe not by 2035 even. So I'm intrigued to hear what Equinor and others have to say about that.
Yeah, it's worth saying that all these panels are in a way linked, of course, because rewiring the country, we have, I think, an estimate of 2062 might be actually when we actually decarbonise the grid.
That's the Tony Blair Institute's estimate, yeah.
Yeah, so if you bear that,
we could still all be here in a very long time, still talking about decarbonisation, which is alarming. But there we are.
Yeah, we're not going to ask you to stay with us until 2062, but certainly we'll cover as much ground as we can for the afternoon. You were talking about global pressures as well, Abby. Obviously, that's partly in contrast to difference and how we're going to build all of these, the infrastructure that we need to look at. But also, we've had 2 reports in 2 days that have basically said UK infrastructure is in lots of trouble as well at the moment, just general how good the government is at building up these big projects. Do you think the government's in a position to kind of get better? Are we going to see a change of government that might actually see a new focus? Where do you think we'll land?
I mean, it's a tricky one. Inflationary pressure is obviously the big point. I mean, in terms of CFDs, the schemes that CFD targets, they're capital-intensive projects. They take a lot of time to get up. You know, the scheme is obviously designed to alleviate some of those pressure points in terms of providing that sense of certainty for investors, but in a world where, you know, project costs are increasing, it does take longer to get, you know, as Charlie said, spades in the ground. And there are also different players vying for investment. You know, it becomes trickier and it becomes more important for the UK to have a really solid offer to industry, and essentially one that they can't say no to. I mean, the reason why we saw AR5 fail to, or under-deliver, is because of those inflationary pressures and price points. Yeah, there's also the pressure of competition. I've said this before, but the UK is competing with other countries who increasingly have attractive things to offer on all of the technologies that we will talk about. You know, there are tax credits on offer in the US for these things. The EU has funding schemes in place. And supply chain is a limited resource at the end of the day.
And that's one of the kind of big sweeping questions that we think about every day, I think, and maybe this is one for you, Charlie, is kind of for a lot of our early reporting, the first 6 months, we wrote about nothing but the IRA in the US and about the EU Green Deal and about competing on what felt like quite an unlevel playing field. Some, as we've already mentioned, some ministers rather liked the idea that the UK was stepping back from subsidies. Some thought it was the only way to get there. Labour have moved around all over the place a little bit recently on how much they will subsidise, but certainly the ambition is there. How much is this going to be a set of difficult financial decisions in the next 10 and 20 years, as much as, green zealotry?
I mean, that immediately makes me think of the 28 billion
Yeah.
and where that has gone. I mean, I think a lot of people maybe in this room looked at that and thought, yes, that's the scale of ambition that is required to really get the UK back into the game globally in terms of the pursuit of the dividends of the green energy transition that is, many would say now, unstoppable across the world. However, Labour have looked at the books. They've also looked at their need to appear sort of fiscally prudent to many Conservative voters that they're trying to win over, and they've said, actually, no, big red mark through that 28 billion. They managed to do it without actually scrapping too much of the scheme, because they never actually said where most of that money was going, which was quite a nifty sleight of hand. But I think that is a real pressure, and I do wonder how much the upward pressure on Labour spending over the next 3 to 5 years, if they do get in, will be a feature of our politics going forward. If the pressures to sort of get back in the global race only grow.
Yeah. So plenty of questions for the UK, plenty of questions that go way, way beyond these shores as well, and we'll be touching on all of those. That will start with Charlie. The three of us are going to quietly leave the stage, leaving Charlie to take over the next session. But for now, thank you very much. I hope you all have a smashing day, and I hope you are all subscribers to our morning email. We work very hard on it, especially the jokes. So if you ever want to tell us more about it, you can always get in touch with the normal ways. All right, thank you very much indeed.